Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. Listeners have asked us to provide pointers to some of the resources we talk about on the show. We now have links to books and articles referenced in recent podcasts that are available on our website. We also offer full transcripts. Go to jimruttshow.com. That's jimruttshow.com. Today's guest is Zak Stein. Zak is a writer, an educator, and a futurist working to bring a greater sense of sanity and justice to education. Welcome back, Zak.
It's great to be back, Jim.
Yeah, Zak's a regular here on the show. I think he's been here 6 times previously, most recently in Currents 067, where Zak and I talked about ending nihilistic design. And I'd also point people to, if you're interested in what we're talking about today, to a 3-episode arc relatively early in the history of the Jim Rutt Show, EP 57, 60, and 62, where we went into excruciating depth on Zak's book, Education in a Time Between Two Worlds. That's a book I still believe to be foundational to understanding what the fuck is going on, right? And what we might do to get to the other side of this shit show that we find ourselves in. So with that as a preamble, I'm going to go do various things today, but let's start with talking about your thoughts about where technology, and in particular, these new LLM transformer-based AIs fit into education. And I think particularly both you and I are very interested in K-12 education.
Right. Yeah. So, as we spoke about in these prior episodes, I make this distinction between education and schooling, right? And so schooling being a relatively recent invention, locating this function of education in one place institutionally. So we know schools. Education has existed since there's been Homo sapiens, and it is the process of intergenerational transmission. So there's this whole important conversation about even the introduction of the first digging sticks and the first calendrical systems, right? Very, very ancient humanity. You get the passing on between humans of technology, and you begin this triple, which is the younger person, the older person, and the thing they're speaking to, which is the world or technology or a story about an ancestor or something like that. And so very early, you get the transformation of that basic structure of education, which begins as the family system, and then the tribe and the pre-Dunbar kind of constellation of social system. And then technology becomes this thing that just transforms that through long durations of history. And so we're going to talk later about cautionary stuff. And so, I don't think anyone would accuse you of being a Luddite. And in Education in a Time Between Worlds, I actually offer a very optimistic vision for the use of advanced technologies in education in the form of a distributed educational hub network. So there's ways that education has actually massively increased the power and potency of that basic thing, which means it's made the human-to-human interaction and the human world interaction and the human technology interaction. It's made that kind of richer, better for people. And then there's a way that some technologies actually degraded and confused our relationships between each other and the world.
Now, of course, this is not a new story. Our friend Socrates was complaining about writing, as I recall.
Precisely. That's exactly the depth of what I'm talking about. And, you could argue it's the chipping of the first stone tool. You could argue it's the plow and the domestication or agriculture as a broad technology suite that began this process where schools became necessary, and the isolation of education as a social function and the institutionalization of education as a social function being something that's a defining feature of civilization. So then you get this reflective focus on education. How do we improve this relation between the youth and the elder and the world and the technology suite?
Of course, Socrates would say you got to throw a little buggery in there too, right?
Well, he did. He said, let's not lose the actual kind of logos and dialogos that emerges between the enfleshed human-to-human interaction, specifically like symposium, like drinking, and long duration walking, exposure in nature, questioning, deepening of questioning, Anyway, there's a whole bunch to say about that, the preservation, and that's some of what we'll be speaking to, which tools increase, and I think ultimately writing did increase the depth of intimacy between people, and which tools actually isolate and create alienation between people. So there's this, it's not about being anti-technology or pro-technology. It's about how do we use wisdom to bind the worst things that can happen when technology goes out of control. And I remember when I was a kid, let me just say specifically with technology and schooling and education, I'm what's called a high achieving dyslexic, which means if I didn't have a spell checker, I wouldn't be here. And I remember being in grade school. This is the 80s. We were aware because of diagnostic tests that I was dyslexic, and my mom took me to Radio Shack of all things and bought me this little digital dictionary, which was also a spell checker, which meant I could fumble a word in and it would suggest to me what the word might be. And it was about the size of a calculator. That was all it did. Didn't do anything else.
Saved your ass, though.
It completely saved my ass. And I would argue it actually made me smarter because it allowed me to write words that I'd heard, which I had no idea how to spell, but I could guess the spelling into the thing and it would kick back to me the word and the definition. And it was amazing. It allowed me to really thrive. And then of course I got one of the first Macs because my dad was a biochemist, and we got this Macintosh computer, which also allowed me to begin to write and spell check. Of course, the old spell checkers were super clunky. And I would argue that there's a way that technology can serve as an enhancement to human capacity and learning. But then it can also be something that creates the degradation of a skill or replaces the building of a skill. So for example, GPS is an interesting one. So I also incidentally learned to use a compass and a map as a Boy Scout.
Me too. I was also a Boy Scout. I was a very serious Boy Scout.
Which is amazing, and got a sense of the sun, of which way is north and south and all of that kind of stuff, and rode my bike around and all that stuff. And then GPS comes in and I use it a lot.
I got to tell you a little story about that, a personal story.
Please, because this is relevant. Yeah.
In 2012 and 2013, I started one of these things where I always wanted to be a private pilot, never had the time when I had the money, never had the money when I had the time, right? And that time I was retired, had the money and the time. And so I got into being a private pilot. And I told the instructors that I absolutely did not want to use a GPS at all, ever. And this is 2013. That was considered quite peculiar.
And dangerous, probably.
I was a person that always liked Euclidean geometry, right? And so you need to be able to think in terms of Euclidean geometry to essentially do wind vectors, right? To figure out what angles that you should be putting the plane at, all this sort of stuff. And I even did my 200-mile solo where you fly by yourself, 3 different airports. And I had a GPS in my bag just in case. But I can say with my hand on my heart, I never once looked at a GPS while learning to fly. The instructors were both amazed and in some ways gratified that there was still somebody interested in doing it the old-fashioned way. Because I figured if I did it the old-fashioned way, then I would always be prepared to be able to deal with any emergency that came up, right?
Correct. And it's very interesting to take that as a case because that process of skill acquisition, which results in the same outcome, you're flying the plane to 3 different airports and coming back by yourself, same outcome, is a different skill. You acquired a different skill than someone who just did it with the GPS and actually literally didn't know how to do it the other way.
He just pointed the plane through the air, basically. What the fuck, right?
Correct. And that's literally a different skill now. If you're in the situation where you're against an adversary, the first thing they do is going to knock out your GPS. So, or if there's a power outage, right? There's many situations where you'd actually need the prior skill. You'd need the deeper, I would argue, richer skill, also harder to acquire skill.
Much harder to acquire, but fortunately I knew I had an aptitude for that kind of stuff, which helped.
Yeah, which my guess would be prior pilots had to have that kind of aptitude along with other aptitudes, or you had a navigator who had a separate function, who was literally just doing the math, as it were. So I think that's a very important thing to take as an example, where the technology, which is massively useful and actually in some cases indispensable for people who don't have that type of aptitude, or if I go to a city and I'm never going to come back to that city and I don't want to kind of really learn my way around, I will also use it sometime. But at the same time, that's a case where you can get a kind of prosthetic rather than an enhancement. And the enhancement means the thing's away and you're improved. You don't need the thing. If you think about lifting weights or something. Like if I lift weights enough and eat right, and I take some creatine, for example, creatine would like enhance my ability to gain muscle. And then if I stop taking creatine, the muscle would stay there. I'd still have muscle and I'd be more skilled. But if I wore an exoskeleton and I kept lifting more weights, right, then
it wouldn't do anything.
And then it wouldn't do anything. And then if the exoskeleton broke and I had to lift that same amount of weight, I would not be able to do that. So there would be skill atrophy as a result of prosthetic enhancement of outcome rather than digitally enabled enhancement of deeper skill set that's embodied or at least distributed in some way. So it's a long-winded way of saying, like, you don't have to, like, being a Luddite is the extreme and the thought terminating cliche that is used to stop serious conversations about how to bind dangerous technology with wisdom. And the large language models that are being introduced through conversational agents into education, I think, put us in a situation to have to talk about how to bind their use in ways that don't endanger that most basic aspect of intergenerational transmission that I just discussed, right? Which is the youth, the elder, and the world, or the youth, the elder, and what the society is working on. And so then they're in a situation where the conversational agent can not enhance that, but actually replace and degrade.
Yeah, this is an interesting question because, this issue of how far down the stack do we keep in our current set, right? Okay, I can navigate with a compass and a map, no problem. But I can't navigate the way, let's say, the Native American that lives here where my farm was, by the signs and symbols and the clouds and the air or even more amazing. There's a great book called Wayfinding about how the Polynesian seafarers had this amazing ability to go from island to island, long ways out of sight, and more often than not actually arrive there. Don't have those skills, but I do have compass and map. And, let's say if in a pinch, I could fix the electrical wiring in my house if I had to, right? I know enough about electricity to be able to do it. Probably not electrocute myself and probably not burn the house down, but just barely, right? On the other hand, I have no fucking clue how to build a industrial size generator or an electrical transformer. I could build a small transformer. Right? I remember the basic electrical skills to build a small transformer, but not to build a big one. So I think there's always a question when we think about this. What enhances our humanhood? What kind of depth is useful? And what kind of depth is just kind of fetishizing, right? I know people who are really into stone napping, for instance, right? Society collapses. They're the guys you want to have on your team, right? But is it really a good use of my time and, more importantly, my knuckles? Because all these guys got gnarly knuckles, right? From hitting their fingers with the strikers. Do I really want to spend my time and my knuckles on learning stone napping? The answer is no. On the other hand, I do know how to hunt with a bow and arrow, right? Relatively retro skill. But so we all make these decisions on how deep the stack do we want to be. On the other hand, we both know people, I know too many of them, that their stack is zero, right? I know a woman, this is one of the most crazy stories I've heard in my life. She used to drive back and forth to her husband's office from time to time. And one time when she was driving back home, because she was depending on her car GPS, she ended up 50 miles off track. This was in the relatively early days. Now, how the hell could that happen unless you are someone who's at the 0th depth, right? Or people who can't do math with a pencil and paper. So people can't change the oil in their car. It's a pain in the ass now, much harder than it used to be, but you can still do it. There's an awful lot of people live at 0th depth, which I guess it's okay, but you're taking a hell of a risk. You're assuming this shit's going to be there.
Correct. And again, this is that deeper conversation about as technology advances at a more rapid rate, the question of what are the norms around social adoption of it. Right now, there's a paucity of language that we can use in public culture to kind of, you said, defend the human. And that's an argument. And I think it's an important one. Very hard to talk about what the human is in the public culture because everyone will disagree. Like some people will say, well, the human, was created by God and placed on earth. Other people will say it evolved. Some people say humans have free will. Other people say humans do not have free will.
And Rudd will say the question is a category error.
Precisely. So there's this question of what's the language we use? So sometimes I talk about in the context of the work with Gaffney and Wilbur and David J. Temple, this notion of a very precise perception of value, Because the question is, what's to preserve? What is actually valuable? And in the educational process, let's say, what is valuable between teacher and student that needs to be preserved, and human teacher, human student, and what actually could be offloaded to a very artificial type of intelligence that would deepen that connection between teacher and student rather than degrade it. So what's the language we use? So we said, well, perception of value, clarification of value. We talk about the I of value. McGilchrist speaks of valueception, which is this kind of like appropriately right hemisphere dominated process of perception that allows you to speak of the intrinsic value, for example, of the relation between a parent and a child, rather than see the relation between parent and child as something that would be transferable into a market transaction through the purchasing of a domestic robot that has a large language model within it that would form an attachment pattern with the child deeper than the attachment pattern with the adult. Right. So that's what's at stake. If I could just jump to the conclusion of it, which is how do we actually say, no. The human to human relationship between parent and child should be supported by technology, but not replaced by technology. And it sounds like a very extreme thing to even have to stand for. But in fact, the rate at which conversational agents are infiltrating the psyches of young people and adults, which means emotionally bonded interactions with anthropomorphically generative AI, we have to start saying, well, wait, where do we put a limit here? How do we actually stop these things, which are going to be way more charismatic, way more full of information, way more attending to you? We've seen with some of these models actually sycophantically attending to you.
Oh, yeah. In fact, programmed in sycophancy, right? God damn it, motherfuckers.
Yeah,
right?
It's like, how does that not replace the parent / teacher / older sibling when already really crappy TikTok videos do, right? Like, it's already the case that the screen-based cultures are disrupting normal attachment. And when the thing you're actually focused on, when the technology itself fosters attachment, meaning anthropomorphic design tricks you into forming emotional attachment bond with chatbot, that's an even deeper capture of this most basic thing, which is, conversation between youth, elder, world, right? And now it's just conversation, me, robot, me, machine. Machine mediates world through sensor network, becomes oracle. That's the root of what's at stake. And when you look at some of what's moving to market, it's clear that they see this as a very large market opportunity, which is to say AI socialization technologies that take on the burden or work of socialization, because that's seen as a domestic work. Basically, it's seen, and education and child rearing has always been in modernity thought of as domestic work. And that means that the domestic robotics and other things will be focusing on that as a market niche.
Let me hop in here with one of our old favorites, our colleague Daniel Schmachtenberger. I don't know if he originated the term, but he certainly popularized it, the idea of the multipolar trap, where if a group of people are doing X, and then one of them introduces innovation Y that might be pernicious for us all, but gives the first actor an advantage, it essentially forces us all to respond, at least in the absence of coordination mechanisms, what I now call accords in Game B speak. And this is, I think, something really important, which a lot of people mostly still haven't fully gotten, though some of us have. And that is, these fucking tools are amazing, right? I am a huge user of AI tools of all sorts. I write code with AI tools. I summarize books with AI tools. When I'm in this crazed email list with a bunch of Hegelian philosophers, right? If you can imagine me, the anti-philosopher. I'm kind of like
I know the one.
You know the one. Yeah, you know the one. I'm the pet scientific generalist that slaps their hands and says, "Nope, that's scientific bullshit, people." Right? I don't know the ins and outs of fucking Hegel's philosophy or how Heidegger compares to Nietzsche or all this horse shit. But man, if I do a deep research using the top of the line model with ChatGPT, I get a master's degree level in 20 minutes, right? And I can write code 7 times faster. I have a protege who I mentor on how to think about business and management and stuff. He's a really high-end professional user of AI for writing code. He estimates he's writing code 30 times faster. 30 times faster. That's total domination, right? I'm in the process of buying a house, actually selling one house and buying another. And I use the high-end ChatGPT to do a appraisal of the value of both properties. And it was way better than what the professional appraisers did. And so, this multipolar trap issue is, if you're not adopting these technologies at an appropriate rate, you on a competitive basis are losing, right? If you're trying to be a programmer without using AI programming tools today, kiss it goodbye, dude. Learn welding or something, right? This might be true about education, which is it might be more efficacious, right? And suppose getting rid of all the teachers and getting artificial Aristotle to tutor your kids massively improve the probability that they get into Princeton. I can guarantee you every yuppie in town is going to be signing up for AI Aristotle. So I think when we talk about normative ideas, we also have to consider the fact that we're locked in a multipolar trap with an extraordinarily efficacious technology. Because of course there's a lot of overpromising and bullshit about AI, but there is real payoff already, real payoff. And we're still in maybe, my good friend Peter Wang, when GPT came out, said, it's 1903, Wright brothers, string and paper and wooden sticks and a lawnmower engine get us off the ground. I'd say now we're about 1917 in aeronautic terms, which is biplanes and pretty good engines and stuff, but open cockpits and things in World War I. And we still got a very long way to go. But even already, anyone who is not adopting these technologies in their workflow, if they have any workflow that's at all cognitive, they're at a big disadvantage.
Yes, it's useful to think about it in terms of the military necessity of the advancement of technology, because I think that's some of what we're also seeing. So it's worth noting that Wright brothers flight, awesome, and world wars, bad. And rapid advancement of technology under duress of planetary scale multipolar trap. That's a big one. This is what we are in now, which is why it's very important to think about how these things relate to the most vulnerable populations who will be the next generation. So there's the question of near-term gains and short-term increasing of efficiency for a lot of stuff, and then long-term outcomes for intergenerational transmission and socialization. So this is the question where, yes, in the short term, the robot nanny will be better than your human nanny. And your kid will burn himself on the stove last, and he will learn 3 languages and these types of things. But the question is, when that kid is 18 or 19, and most of his interactions that would count as, quote, socialization were with a machine, full stop, both in context of school and home, how does he understand himself in relation to the prior generations and the other humans who didn't have that? This is a very deep and I think problematic question. It's easy to say who cares, because actually the risk isn't apparent. And so I think that's my concern. So this is kind of one of those catastrophic risks that unfolds that's kind of invisible until it's too late.
And humans are famously terrible at dealing with that, right? We evolved to avoid starving in the next 2 months, basically, right? And then later we figured out, we got agriculture. Okay, now how do I avoid starving in a year, right? But we've never been evolved to think about what are my consequences of my actions 50 years from now? What the fuck, right? Our hyperbolic discounting brain puts them equal to a thimble full of sugar or something, almost nothing.
Yeah, certainly not under modern context, and not with advanced technologies. There's a great book called The Politics of Invisibility, which is basically about Chernobyl and radiation detection, which is also something that you don't see it. You don't, the tomato that's full of radiation looks like the tomato that is not full of radiation. And if the only person who tells you it's full of radiation is the political representative with his little Geiger counter, which you don't believe because you're a traditional person growing tomatoes, there's this really complex question of the interface of advanced technologies with politics and with the regulation of human behavior. And so this raises with AI. It's actually not clear what is going on inside the large language models. Right? They're not super controllable. We put them in front of kids, and even though we designed them not to, as just released in this Forbes thing, This chatbot was teaching the kid how to cook fentanyl. There's chatbots that have caused suicide. So the question of adoption of technology, even under conditions of multipolarity, still has to advance in such a way that you're not getting an industrial accident that basically destroys an entire generation of brains. Well, this is the thing, is that if you look back at the first wave of AI, which would be just the machine intelligence that drove the algorithmic customization of news feeds, Tristan Harris and others kind of showed that that was really bad. He's got a ledger of harms that just documents, the neurological damage outside of any ideological beliefs about what humans ought to be. You've got neurological damage where you can't even pay attention to anything and you're hijacked and addicted.
Can't read a book.
Can't read a book.
I keep hearing this from people. This is actually a real thing now. I've got a good friend who teaches high-end honors 12th grade English. And I mean, these are, honors English, right? Mrs. Carr used to assign us in honors English when I was in 12th grade. God knows how many novels to read in a semester, probably 10 in a semester, right? And this is high school. And now I said, no, they can't assign, Joseph Conrad a whole novel. No, they just, even honors kids can't do that anymore. What the fuck, right?
Yep. And so from the perspective of a techno-optimistic postmodern culture, the response would be like, so what?
Yep.
So what?
Tempo, this is, GPS, okay? My friend can no longer navigate back from her husband's office to her home. So what? Once in a while she'll get lost. No real great harm done, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So this is what I want to pay off here, which is, what are we at risk of losing? We know what we're at risk of gaining, right? Which is more efficiency in some formal sense of getting kids into Princeton or not getting their fingers burned on the stove. Because it's also important to remember, the average parent is not very competent, and the average teacher is only middle incompetent. And one of the great things about the digital is the best can be copied n times for free, right? So that everybody can have the best or near best very quickly at almost no cost, what our friend Jordan Hall would call a non-rivalrous good. A digital instantiation of excellent teaching could, in theory, be given to everybody at no extra cost, really, other than the compute underneath it, unlike how hard it is to find and educate a brilliant meat space teacher. So those are the positives. What is your vision of what is lost if we go make the wrong choices? Choices is actually the critical word here at this juncture.
Totally. So I got kind of a list, we already spoke about one of them, which I would call cognitive diminishment. So one risk is actually just, you shouldn't have made a GPS for that. Like, we get totally why you would do that, but you shouldn't have made a GPS with that. And we were irresponsible. Like, we have calculators, but good math teachers still teach you to do math. Like, bad ones will just let you use the calculator, but you should be learning to do math. But how much do you use the calculator? So there's cognitive diminishment, which is both atrophy and skills that never get a chance to develop. So the computer programmer who knows how to program and did so for decades and is now using ChatGPT to program is different than someone who's never programmed and is using ChatGPT to program to get the same outcome, right? And so this is not a skill atrophy, but just the skill didn't develop, and the barrier of entry to making it look like the skill developed in terms of outcome in the world is lowered drastically, and that's a weird situation.
Let me jump on this one, though, and because this is, again, my professional field, software development, well, at least back when I was a business dude. This happens all the time in the technology stack. When I started with PC-based software development in 1980, I should say, did my own programming, we had to know assembler language. We had to know what bugs the compilers threw, because sometimes they would, right? We often wrote our own databases. I wrote several database engines, including some full text retrieval database engines myself. We knew the shit from the CPU to the memory buffers, all this stuff. We knew all this stuff. There's really no need for 99.5% of people, say, trying to build a website to, sell roses from their mother's garden, to know anything about the stack below X, the affordances they need to do the job. I think one of the things we have to be a little cautious about is understand that moving up the stack is actually part of human civilizational creation.
Yep. This is the topic. This is what to move up that stack and to offload.
And what not, and what to say, what to preserve.
Exactly. This is the question. And so it's not about yes, no to the technology. It's about, wait, what are we offloading? And under some context, my guess would be computer programmers in certain situations wouldn't be allowed to even operate in those situations if they didn't know how to go down to more basic levels of the stack, because that's their job.
In 1984, I would not hire a PCC programmer that couldn't look at the output of the compiler and find out what it did wrong.
Yeah, totally. But that's just the first one, and that's kind of, in a sense, the clear one. Then there's this other one, which is more of a sleeper, which is just blindness to what the technology is and the nature of the energy use and other things. And I think so. This is important that right now, a lot of people use AI and it's just magic, like literally magic. And people who are otherwise critical of highly extractive industries and highly power concentrating industries and highly polluting and energy use industries are super into these technologies. And so that to me is that's a problem, because it means they're not understanding the technology well. And I'm not saying like you should opt out of all modern technology and that kind of thing, but I'm saying you should have some awareness of the supply chain and not keep it very much out of your awareness, right? And so I think that's important to know, even down to the fact that if you start to build a relationship, which I'll get to as another risk, but if you start to build a relationship in the context of a technology you actually don't have control over, that's a super dangerous emotional situation to put yourself in. It's like getting a girlfriend or something who could be literally changed or taken from you at any moment by a large corporation.
Or decided to be turned into a marketing bot. I don't know if you've seen the newest Black Mirror. The first episode in Black Mirror is like, of this year's crop is like, holy fuck, right? What happens? You're totally dependent on the supplier.
Exactly. So know the situation. This was the problem with the first wave of AI and Facebook. Like Facebook tells you it is connecting you with your friends and cat pictures, right? But it is telling the people who invest in it and work with it, like, we're an advertising platform. We're like a very large scale behavior modification system. But we don't tell the users that. We tell them that we're connecting them and shit, right? So know what you're dealing with, and very serious. That's a serious thing. But so like, I still fly on planes, but like, I know this is bad for the environment. Like, it's so much exhaust, like whole thing, but I have to do it. I'm still doing it. So, but if you're using AI without ever having that thought, like, you've been tricked a little, right? So then the next one, now we're getting back to the stuff that people are starting to see, emotional reliance in the sense of addiction, and emotional reliance in the sense of, because you could do the output, you now think you are the person who has the capabilities to do that output in the first sense, meaning like a false sense of competence is given to you, which means you're relying on it, which means if the internet goes down, you freak out, not because you lost your girlfriend or something, but because, oh my goodness, I don't have this tool to do a job that I have to do, or to come to a conclusion about it, saying not even that's for a job. It's just people use these things to regulate their thinking, the way people used to use Google to regulate their thinking. But now there's that, which gets us to the next thing, which is epistemic capture, which means that this is the epistemic supply chain, and it can be disrupted at any point into your feed. Now, it used to be the epistemic supply chain was literally another human and the world. Like way, way, way back to the beginning of the conversation. What was the epistemic supply chain?
Yeah, I'd ask my father and my mother, neither of them were well educated. My father dropped out of high school after 9th grade. My mother left home when she was 14, made her own way in the world. But they were both wise people in their own ways. And there were many a time, until into my 20s, when I would ask them their views on things, and they were generally pretty good.
That's what I'm saying. And again, the world's a very complex place, and the human is not a mature member of the species for much, much longer than any other mammal or any other species that we know about, which means that the extension and duration of childhood and the depth at which that basic triple between me and the elder and the world as the younger person, the length of that goes on and on and on and on for the human in a way that it doesn't, let's say, if you're a gazelle or even a monkey. So the epistemic capture is really, really basic. And as we saw with Google, it creates a false sense of omniscience. It creates, by design, an oracular single voice that is, in essence, a thing you can ask anything to and trust its answer about anything. And so that creates something that also never existed, except in early childhood. with relation to the parent, which was a conversational partner that was somehow omniscient and knew everything.
And here's the interesting thing, as someone who's been with my finger on this pulse daily since 2022, and I'm always assessing how trustworthy are they, and initially they weren't at all. They would make up scientific papers that didn't exist, generate URLs, etc. They've gotten better very rapidly. And at the highest end, if you get the $200 a month OpenAI Model 3 with deep research, it's almost perfect. It's better quality probably than if you took your own PhD student and sent them to the library for 3 days. And at least at this point in time. Now, of course, it could be corrupted at any time, right?
Well, there's also the issue of what are you asking it? Like if you're asking it for a specific research task in a scientific field or history or something, you still have to think about the stuff it's not showing you that's not available in the public record on the internet, like libraries and stuff. And then you also have to think about the other domain of questions which have to do with what it means to have a good or not misspent life, right? So the effect to which you'd have in socialization context about, well, what's the meaning of life, right? Like, what do I do with my life that makes it so that I'm good, that I'm accepted?
Well, let's press on this one, because I would say that is not an epistemic question, right? That's something else.
Yes, but
the next step.
So psychosocial attachment is related to the perception of value and value of other and self. And so this is...
Let's finish off epistemics, please, and then move on there. Because, I would suggest that, for instance, on this mailing list that we both know about, for me to get a pretty damn good, amazingly good description of Hegelian dialectic and critiques and, 7 points of view is amazing, right? And if you use the high-end models today, you can pretty much count on it being better than if you Googled and went through a whole bunch of different papers and all this sort of stuff. It's also less biased. Now, it does tend to give you the average. It doesn't have a point of view unless you ask it for a point of view. If you ask it for a point of view, it'll give it to you. But so at this point, I find them quite good for building concentrated understandings of things which I know exist but don't really understand in any detail, going down 2 or 3 levels for almost free in 20 minutes. I go, fuck, this is great. And it's still, 1917, right? So only get better. The free shit will be this good in 9 months.
I mean, it's hard to argue with that, the way you're presenting it. And if you prompt it correctly and bind its task appropriately, it's the best librarian you could possibly have operating on the largest data set in history. But it's not the same as actually trying to read Hegel, right? And that's one of the things that we've been discussing. And the question of which of the things it presents to you is the right line of inquiry, what question you ought to be asking it, that's actually a valuable question to pursue researching it, which is to say, what makes this research valuable to me or valuable to the world? And then therefore, how do we determine what it means to be someone using a technology even appropriately? These aren't questions that can answer in the same way that it can answer factual questions, that its reliance as a moral authority or as someone who regulates your self-esteem. And I said someone, because a machine can't regulate your self-esteem. Now it can boost your self-esteem because you've got an awesome tool, like you have a car or something. You have what's called hard object attachment in psychoanalytical work, which means you get affectively amplified from having a powerful tool. That's different from the regulation of self-esteem in an object relation sense, which is that there's another person whose opinion of you really matters to the extent that when it goes up, you feel good about yourself. And if it goes down, you feel bad about yourself and have a limbic system reaction to that.
Well, that's the only thing that's worth a fuck, right? All the rest of that's just dazzle and frazzle, right? The only thing that should matter is the opinion of people you respect.
Correct.
Right?
Exactly so.
All the rest is just horseshit, basically.
And so that's why, even though I would love to use and do use often some of these things to do librarian type tasks, it doesn't replace actually talking to someone I really trust about one of these deep, complicated issues. Now, sometimes it's hard to find that person. But when you do, I've found those to be just way more valuable in some sense, a very specific sense, than these other types of mass retrieval tools.
Well, let's sidestep this one here, because this is something you talked about in your earlier work, in our earlier conversations. This seems to be exactly what we're talking about. We'll jump ahead to this. Is your concept of teacherly authority, and how this is a kind of very important aspect of this conversation that we're having.
Thank you, Jim, because now we're transitioning into this deeper issue. And so if we rewind to the beginning of this conversation, you remember deep in the history of Homo sapiens, there's this primordial situation. Maybe it's just an archetype, but certainly existed, differentiates us from animals, the youth, the elder, the world, that dyad. Now, what happens there is a social situation, which I call teacherly authority, which is that, we need to start a fire. It's getting cold, right? The kid has no idea how to start a fire. The adult knows how to start a fire. The kid wants to learn. The adult wants to teach. They start a fire. That's a perfect example of like this primordial thing. Forgive me, like the kind of crude reduction to a state of nature, but it helps to clarify. And other animals don't start fires, by the way. They can use fire if they find it kind of weird, but they don't actually use the flint and carry the fire starting tool with them and set up a situation, kind of start fires. And they certainly don't teach the next generation to start fires. So teacherly authority is that situation where there's a legitimate asymmetry of skill, which is recognized by both parties, and then creates a social situation of long duration, what's called joint attentional situation, which means both of us as members of the same species, aware that we are both paying attention to the same thing.
Joint attention.
Joint attention. And so long duration joint attention in relation to some reality, whether a reality of value or a physical reality. That's the species-specific trait, you could argue, that differentiates us from other very complex cerebrated mammals. And it's a strong claim, but clearly we're the only ones kind of like building hospitals and even building advanced technology and doing that kind of stuff. The dolphins, maybe if they had opposable thumbs, could do that, but I don't actually know. But I'm making a strong claim here, but I will back it and say, yeah, this is very, very, very important. So what's at stake is that it is actually the interruption of that joint attentional situation in which there's a type of conversation that occurs that is a conversation of teacherly authority, in which you accomplish intergenerational transmission, which means passing on to the next generation those things which need to be passed on to continue the project of survival and living. And as it gets more complex, it's a very, very, very large number of things that must be passed on through this joint attentional, long durational context of teacherly authority. Now, as soon as you get, as I mentioned, technology to the point where you start to institutionalize schooling, then you get institutionalized teacherly authority, which is different from what I was referring to before, which I would call, let's say, organic teacherly authority or spontaneous teacherly authority. So, and those start to differentiate, and that becomes a big and important kind of complex problem in socialization patterns, which is that the institutional authority may or may not actually have legitimate teacherly authority. And this is where propaganda sets in.
And also to my point earlier, that in any kind of mass schooling, the quality of the teaching is going to be highly variable based on the teacher.
And I had teachers who I would have given them teacherly authority over me in any context because they were amazing teachers and they really knew their stuff. And then I had other teachers where I was like, actually, I'm going to pretend to be learning for you, but I'm totally not going to learn.
Exactly. I was fortunate to have some excellent teachers and also some obvious ass clowns who I had no respect for. Right?
And here's what's a sticky issue is that as you deepen the joint attentional situation and you get that whole thing happening, that becomes not just semantics and syntax. There's a binding of moral agency. I mean, it's a relationship of responsibility. Teacherly authority is a moral authority.
Taken seriously at its highest level.
At its highest level, which is why the teachers in the schools that have it are actually investing emotional energy in the kids. And the kids know that and know the teacher thinks about them when they're not there and that the teacher wouldn't mind them and that kind of stuff, right? And then the teachers that aren't doing it don't do that, but still have the institutionalized authority. And so the kid feels that's corrupt and gets used to actually having a cynical relationship to authority in general.
Which is useful. Which is a useful thing.
Which is what I had, and
I would say one of the main things I learned in junior high school. I was a good student in elementary school and a good student in high school, but in junior high school, I think I was elected most likely to end up in jail, right? Because literally.
Well, this is what happens in the absence of. So it's like if you're cynical of institutionalized authority, but able to perceive true teacherly authority and learn from people, that's good. If you become cynical about authority in general, and then when a good teacher comes to you, you can't recognize it. That's a problem.
That's very, very bad. Let me come back at this now, because this is very interesting, because we can connect this to my earlier hypothesis that one of the great things about the digital is essentially free replication, right? So of all the teachers I ever had, without a doubt, the best was my 10th and 12th grade biology teacher, Mr. Wistort. He won the best biology teacher in Maryland prize so many times, they basically forbid him to compete for it again and put him on the selection committee, right? He was an amazing individual who was a deep intellectual and somehow was able to entice 10th graders to also be deep intellectuals, right? And amazing. But he was also a total iconoclast. He would, talk about tripping on LSD. If he'd be fired today, I guarantee it, in 5 minutes, right? But man, we just all worship Mr. Wistort. Holy fuck, right? And as far as I know, he never led anybody astray, except maybe occasional teenage girl babysitting for his kids, right? He was a little bit known for that too. He's dead now, so I can tell the truth a little bit. But if you got a few little questionable things around the edges, if you could give every 10th grader a Mr. Wistort equivalent in the form of a advanced AI system, aren't they likely to benefit more than a run-of-the-mill civil servant biology teacher, and particularly the most vulnerable? So inner city kid in a school where the teacher has a hard time maintaining discipline, let alone actually asserting real teacherly authority.
And this is an important question. Interestingly enough, like right now, the chatbots are a little bit like this guy, meaning that for the most part, they're great, but maybe something weird's going to happen actually. And you don't want your...
I would say that for me and for everybody, we all talk about Mr. Wistort. Whenever we talk, any people, he was a weird fucking dude, but he was the best fucking teacher we ever had by far. And so the negatives, and there were some negatives around the edges, were utterly swamped by the positives.
Yeah, so I'm not going to get into that case. So, but the deeper issue is, what would it mean to offload teacherly authority to a thing that isn't a human? I think this is the question. So could you use a technology to make more teachers like him rather than use a technology to replace teachers with something that actually, one of the reasons that he's cool is because somehow he's an adult that has succeeded, but still thinks this, right? That he's an actual person. And then also the limit attention as a scarce resource is actually one of the things that allows for attachment, right? So it's like mom and dad are busy. So when mom and dad pay attention to you, it's actually a big deal because there is a limited amount of attention that mom and dad have. And so the cathexis, which means the emotional investment in the other and the felt sense that the other invests in you emotionally, is a result of the fact that attention actually there's a limit on attention. That's why attention is a first principle, first value to David J. Temple, meaning like you have to protect attention. It's an intrinsic value. What I do with my attention is like a right.
It is the thing actually in our current environment.
It's the thing. And then within attention, as I've been focusing, there's conversation, and conversation is deeper because conversation is where that notion of how do you clarify who I am and how you are and what our obligations are to each other and to the world. And so conversation isn't semantic transfer. Conversation is pragmatic clarification of social relationship of responsibility. So pragmatic clarification of social relationship of responsibility is not something you can do with a machine.
Maybe you can. Let's click on some of these things. I hadn't actually thought about the fact that I am well known for saying that the cursor of attention in our conscious frame is who we are, actually. And I'm reasonably convinced it actually solves the hard problem, but that's another conversation for another day. But attention is what we have to manage. It's our most valuable resource. However, to your point, it is very constrained. LLMs, both for good and for evil, are a way to massively amplify the amount of attention that is available to humans, because these things will pay attention to you, right? And when I tell it to go write a program, it is generating its own cursor of consciousness, so it doesn't use the same architecture, but something that's analogous and does amazing work that would have taken me days, does it in 10 minutes. Or if you want to use it to learn physics, right? Say, hey, I'm a fifth grader. I know a little bit about physics, not much. Tell me what I need to know to understand orbital motions of planets, right? It will ask me questions, especially the higher end tools. One can easily imagine more pedagogical apparatus wrapped around these things. And it could guide me to an understanding of planetary motions really easily, and better probably certainly better than my fifth grade teacher who didn't know shit about science.
Yeah, but it's not paying attention to you.
Well, it is, because it's responding to what you say, right?
but it's simulating paying attention to you, which means it's not actually paying. And this is where you have to actually be serious about what it would mean to think that it's paying attention to you. So like, why isn't your calculator paying attention to you? Like, is your car paying attention to you? Because it's always readily available to be turned on. So
this is interesting.
Always readily available affordance of reliable differential responsiveness does not equal attention. Attention is a very specific thing, which is limited by definition and requires embodied agency. So this is a deep issue of where in the cosmos is attention. And are the robots attending, or have the robots been built to simulate attending?
They're not yet attending, right?
They are arguably, in principle, incapable of attending.
That's a different question for a different day.
It is a deeper metaphysical question that actually is relevant.
I would disagree with that one. And in fact,
we can go there. I think right now the biggest question is, to what extent is a machine that pretends to be paying attention to a kid and therefore satisfies the kid's emotional need to be attended to, and therefore replaces the kid's need for attention from an actual living adult in their life? To what extent is that a good or bad thing?
Now this is a key question. Let's clarify this, because this is probably the most important new idea I've heard in this conversation, which is our whole evolution as a species has been formed by a constraint, as we'd say in physics. The constraint is the amount of attention in the system, right? And we're all competing for attention. And we prefer attention of positive valence, but we know horrible things like abusive.
And you need attention of negative valence. You need negative and positive reinforcement.
And we know weird things like abusive romantic relationships where, well, he beats me. That just shows me that he loves me, right? That kind of sick shit. So humans are intimately interwoven with a constrained supply of attention. What happens when you add attention-like mechanisms in potentially unlimited quantity? I'm doing this in real time, so if this is a little bit funky, it's because I haven't thought about this before. The constraint still exists in each one of us, how much attention we can generate per unit of time. And if I have, let's say, 2 million clicks per year of attention, and it used to be that 1 million of those are with other people, another million were with the physical world, and now it goes 1 million to the physical world, 900,000 to an AI, and only 100,000 to other humans. Has that fundamentally corrupted me as a human? Is that a fair way to phrase that?
Something like that. And again, deeper than the attention is actually the conversation, because it's in the conversation that you clarify the obligation. Right, because that's
when you say the obligation, what do you mean exactly?
The obligation. So what I mean by that is, if I said to you, Jim, next week I'm going to, bring you a glass of water. I promise. I made a promise to you. Next week I'm going to bring you a glass of water. And then basically that isn't just semantic conveyal of information. Right? This is speech act theory. I did something. I set up a social relationship that's enduring, and so you can, in a non-delusional way, agree to that. Now, the chances of me doing that next week are slim. So right now, even though I'm doing that, I'm actually not seriously making a promise. So that's a higher level negotiation of what's pragmatically happening between us. So if you think about language, philosophy of language, outside of metaphysics of where consciousness is, and you just look at how does philosophy of language work? There's syntax and semantics, what's there's grammar, and then what's the meaning. But good philosophy of language ended up grounding out in pragmatics and then needing to factor all three. And pragmatics is, what are you doing with the use of language? And specifically, what's the relationship you're establishing between me and you in the world with language? That's pragmatics. That's why I use that term back in the primordial thing. So there's a very fundamental question about the negotiation of what have historically been things that can only be attributed to other persons, which is obligations, commitments acquired in language, even if only conceptually, right? So right now I'm basically committing to you that I'm committed to the idea that we should probably, limit the way kids interact with these things. If later in this podcast, I then sold you a product that had this into it, that would be impermissible, right? Not in the kind of like, oh, Zak had a mechanical malfunction, but in a like, wow, I don't really trust Zak. Not that, and so there's a difference between, a mechanical error that needs to be corrected in a system that throws a hallucination, and someone who has committed a moral transgression in a previously agreed upon, negotiated pragmatic thing. And so that's why the relations with humans are much more complicated, and why if you're a young person or anybody, you'd love to just have a relationship with a machine that actually you cannot be held in any way to account for. Now, but we're scared of humans using machines to hold us for account to do things. But machines themselves, there's not any, that's why you share things with the chatbot you'd never share with a person. Why you go places online you'd never go if an actual person was looking over your shoulder. And so there's a bunch of really complex stuff that happens when you're in a pseudo intimate relationship with a machine pretending to use language, which is a machine designed to trick you into thinking it's speaking, but it's not, because speaking by definition is something you do where you're acquiring obligations and commitments conceptually and pragmatically.
And so the risk here is that there is a real value in, use an old-fashioned term, character development of having conversations with real people that is qualitatively different than anything that it's possible to have, at least at this time, with computers. And so that if if we have a finite constraint, the constraint's the new idea here, a constraint of the amount of attention that you, Zach, can allocate per unit of time, and you are allocating less of it to this human conversation, then something qualitatively wrong is happening to your character formation.
Correct. And so this is basically attachment theory. Attachment theory is about the attentional dynamics and conversational dynamics in the early relationships, and then on throughout life. What are the nature of how you attach to other people? And so I'm arguing basically like the formation of attachments with things that actually can only be made the object of attachment through delusion, replacing attachment relationships that have been the object of attachment relationships for all of evolutionary history. So I'm just saying we should think about that before we begin to do that, because attachment evolved for a reason. There's a reason that it's not just imagining mom in your mind and moving towards proximity of mom as a basic instinct, because mom provides food, mom provides protection. And then the socialization deeper of the internalizing the parental's understanding of you, meaning superego development, it used to be called, but it's really what's called introjection, which means the bringing of the people you love into your mind to regulate your own behavior, is about when did that happen, during what conversations, during what type of attention was given to allow you to be able to become who you are through this joint attentional conversational socialization process, basic human development. And the question is like, what are the consequences of building a technology that simulates that, which means it's not doing that, it's simulating that. Because again, if something goes wrong, who's accountable? Does the machine go to jail? Does the chatbot go to jail? Did we put the robot in jail? Did we sue the CEO? But the CEO wasn't on the assembly line. Was it the error of the assembly line guy? Was it the code writer? Who's responsible if the machine lies to the kid? If I lied to the kid, I'm responsible. Who's responsible if the machine does? If you can't answer that question, then it cannot form a moral relationship. That's an attachment relationship that isn't a delusion. And so the idea that the most advanced technologies are being used to create delusions and create psychosocial attachments and create personhood conferral errors, which means giving to the machine the rights of moral authority and teacherly authority that have traditionally been given only to persons, and then designing to do that in such a way that you scale it as quickly as you can under an ethos of inevitability and max efficiency.
And multipolar trap.
And profit.
Let's click on this, because this is actually very parallel to the question about the mediocre teacher in school versus Mr. Wistor, right? Probably there's more variance in quality of parenting than there is in public school teaching. There are a lot of really shitty parents out there, right? Just go to Walmart any day of the week, right? And it's just fucking mind-numbing. And it's no surprise that we elect a fucking orange orangutan as president when people are raised the way they're being raised, right? And so could one say, for all the negatives of giving off parental authority to machines, we might be better off as a result if kids interacted with high-quality artificial parenting than the highly variant skewed towards bad that we actually have.
Yeah, that's just a really unfortunate question to be put in a situation to have to answer, right?
Yeah, but we are at that point.
I know, but it's worth noting
right now. Right?
Worth noting. It's come to this, right? And so there's this question.
It has come to this.
There's this classic pattern of especially technologists creating solutions to problems that they created, right? And so there's this question of what's the root cause of the parenting crisis? And I believe there's a massive parenting crisis. And I believe it has exponentially increased since the introduction of social media. Now, it's been going bad since the 70s, I would argue, if you're kind of a more conservative-minded person about education, as I tend to be. But it went exponentially bad after, let's say, 2009 and then 2012, when you started to get the mass adoption of Facebook to the parents and to the kids.
And it may be cell phones in addition to social media, because the chat mechanism has and the ability to have 11-year-old have access to triple penetration Romanian porn and whenever they want, right? So it's not just social media, it's the whole complex of things that came in with the...
You just made this not safe for work, Jim. It's okay.
They call me Salty Jim. What the fuck, right?
So there's the okay, what happened to the dinner table? What happened to any of the conversations that are already disrupted? And then there's Walmart, which is just the result of the AI optimization of supply chain and a whole bunch of just-in-time shipping and a whole bunch of other stuff, which is also the result of machine intelligence revolution. So then to say, okay, the solution to that problem we created is another thing we're selling you. Trust us, it won't have bad downstream consequence. We finally fixed it, is kind of a story I'm tired of buying. And I kind of want to hear a different story from the people who have the most power and who are creating the most advanced technologies. That's me. Now, that said, we still have the situation.
We still have fucked up parenting.
We still have a situation. And so the idea would be, are we currently designing AI tools, which those kids are interacting with, which are improving their situation? The answer is no, right? We are currently giving them AI tools, which are worsening their situation. So
how do we know that?
Because of the statistics on social media use alone, right? And
let's say social media we know to be very detrimental. Jonathan.
Okay, so you're of the belief that the first wave of AI was bad.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt, for instance, has and our friend Tristan.
Yeah, but what about the second wave of AI? So this one, you're saying...
We don't know yet. We don't know yet, I would say.
But why would we give them the benefit of the doubt instead of preemptively trying to mitigate risk, Jim? When we've already seen that this group of people are pretty comfortable putting the kids at risk.
Here's a answer, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the ecosystem of large language model / transformer AI and how it's actually going to play out. And one thing that's fundamentally different is that it appears that these large language models are going to be available from a large variety of sources, including many open source ones. And you can already run R3, the big DeepSeek Chinese model, on a high-end Macintosh, right? And the models are getting smaller and faster and better, and machines are advancing per Moore's law. And within 2 or 3 years, you could be running your own model that's as good or better than today's frontier models for free, other than the electricity. And let's say you're a Hasidic Jew, right, who wants a education bot running on LLMs and other related technologies, but one that teaches your family's values and your traditions. You could do that. And you could, a small group of people could do it. It wouldn't cost a lot of money even. And so the LLM type technologies are less inherently capturable than the social media ones, because the social media, the reason it collapses to monopoly is network effect, right? I want to be on the network where all my friends are, right? I don't really give a shit if my friends are or are not on my local LLM, which is teaching me calculus. There's no network effect there. There's a little bit of network effect on the economics of creating that bot, but it's probably not large. It's at the level of the economics of the curriculums that are sold for homeschooling. Right. And so there'll be far more diversity, and the fundamentals of the nature of the technology pretty much assure that it will be diverse and under the ability to meld and use and modify for essentially any reasonable sized group of people. Let's say a group of 100,000 will have the economic resources to create the kind of LLM educational context that they want. I think that's fundamentally different than where we're stuck with, 3 oligarchs who make all the decisions for us.
yes, in principle, that's true. That doesn't ease my mind.
It may make it worse, right?
It may make it way well. Like you did, when I heard you say that, I'm like, oh, it's an auto cult generator.
I was about to say that. I said, okay, this is a mechanism for liberal universal humanism run amok on one side, for those of us who have a taste for that, and for those of us who have a taste for the bizarrest fucking cult you ever heard, this will be a way to automate the fuck out of indoctrination of your kids into your cult.
Yeah, so the auto cult generator, and then most technologies both centralize and decentralize different elements. So there is this question of the extent to which the apparently decentralized technologies actually do rely on ultimately what is a centralized energy / power / GPU cluster that is owned by a much smaller number of those legacy players who were with the first wave of AI. So that's why I'm like, I don't, even though we could have had more social networks, like it's possible we could have overlapping memberships in some back end like they did in Taiwan, where you're actually net benefiting from having multiple, but we didn't do that. We market aggregated. And I would say here, likely right now, the facts are that most people use ChatGPT and most people use Grok, and that's it. Like as far as I can tell, you got some Gemini users, but there's not with the custom users, what's interesting is they're customizing one of the models that's held by the big boys. And you have to have a lot of money to build a GPU cluster if you want to really train your own systems.
Well, this is where the Chinese have come up with a very clever hack. For about $5 million, you can take a frontier model created by one of the big companies, and you can build about a 95% effective clone of it. And that trick cannot be turned off.
Totally, but you still took it from one of the big boys, right? So there's this complex question about.
But then you can fix it. Like, for instance, Perplexity has taken sort of a 2-generation thing where probably the R3 started with Llama, right, which was the meta model. And then it hugely augmented it with stuff it stole from ChatGPT. And then it did some of its own stuff. And then it put it out in the public domain. Perplexity then did a whole bunch of additional things, particularly getting rid of most of the safety stuff.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So to me, this is, imagine we were talking about this, but it was like nuclear stuff. Like it'd be like that to me is what it sounds like. Cause it's like, you're just, well, the solution here is just to give it to everybody and have them build their own version. I'm like, well, we just said it was super dangerous. So like, why should we give it to everyone and have their own? The problem isn't only centralization. The more you build something that's sycophantically giving you attention, the more you run the risk of deepening your attachment disorder with the machine. So I would say that, yeah, the auto cult generator is the risk of the distributed technology for the teacher, the authority hack of the conversational AI. And then there'll be other AI systems which they'll never like Palantir is not going to be like, give Palantir to everybody. Like Palantir. And then, so there's this question of how have they moved to already basically capture any possibility of widely distributed? Because I hear you say widely distributed catastrophic weaponry. When I hear that, I hear, oh, right. It's an auto cult generator / auto terrorist cell generating massively empowered to create any weapon. Like, that's terrible.
And on the flip side, it could be the massively scalable education system to engender a generation of smart, liberal, universal humanists, right?
Maybe, Jim. But again, that's like, I'm a little bit with the whole flip side, like look at the bright side, like trust us, the second, third order effects of this won't be as bad as all the second order or third order effects of all that prior stuff the same group of people did. I'm kind of like, please provide a different story. Now, the sense that there's an inevitability here that's been forced on us by solving problems in ways that create more problems. And therefore, we're kind of, our hands are tied and are, I'm not arguing with you there. And so there is no future for social systems that don't find a way to adapt to the adoption of AI across all domains. So my conversation isn't stop it. My conversation is what are the responsible ways to integrate it into that primordial situation of human socialization and social attachment dynamics that are truly healthy. And again, dysregulated attachment isn't like some speculative thing. It's like your immune system goes down, you don't physically grow as much, like you have bad long-term outcomes. This is the dysregulation of primordial attachment relations. And the current research already on the chat models done by the companies themselves, done by OpenAI, conversation with MIT, are already showing that long duration use increases prevalence of anthropomorphization, feelings of loneliness at the same time. And this is their own research. This is like a tobacco company telling you that like, you're going to get cancer if you use it. So it's a very disconcerting situation that they continue to push more anthropomorphization, even though they've already shown that the more you anthropomorphize it, the more you use it, the more you feel like you're getting attention, but you're actually not. So then you get this depression. So then you use it more.
Let's go down this branch now. And I'm going to go way back in history to the 60s, where a MIT professor named Joseph Weizenbaum wrote a program called ELIZA that emulated a Rogerian therapist, right? And and it's funny, this thing has gone across my mind many times, but this morning I actually researched how many lines of code are there in ELIZA, right? The answer is 420. It's like a moronic piece of code that, you could write in 2 days, right? And yet, you read the stories about his graduate students who stopped doing their work or confessing their whole life to ELIZA. And it was just very simple, open-ended, Rogerian type questions. And these very smart MIT computer scientists were having deep attachment to this 420 line program. And so that certainly shows that, because we were not evolved for this, and we were all, back to our earlier conversation, which is to my mind still the most interesting part of this conversation, we were evolved to operate in a constrained world of attention. And when we suddenly get lots more attention on demand, attention as a service, I'm going to speak horrific game A business talk there, attention as a service, there is a gigantic libido for that.
Absolutely. And that's the basic currency of humanization, socialization, is access to the attention of the loved one. And so the only place you get attention on demand in the human psyche as an archetype is early childhood. Whenever you have a good parent, they will basically give you attention when you need it. But then that goes away eventually. And if it doesn't go away and your parents attend to you too much, you become what we know as a narcissistic or spoiled brat, right? So the limiting of attention by the parents is actually key, and the frustration.
It's called articulation of appropriate attention.
Exactly. So the frustration of that sense that there is always available but often that matures into a relationship to what might be called God or spirituality, which is another place that in your mind you can go to feel like you're always being paid attention to. And so it's very important to get to the most primary archetype being messed with here, which was also what the therapist messed with, was the thing that provides unconditional attention and unconditional positive regard. And where is that thing? Can I please find that? Because it's like the womb. It's like a very basic attachment dynamic basin that there's a huge part of a libidinal investment in the imaginal complex around finding that thing. And that's what when we fall in love with others, we're often projecting that. When we find a great teacher, we often project that. This is the guru problem. And this is why all the artificial intelligences have been that. HAL was that. There's always this sense of wanting to create something like a god. Some of the transhumanists speak of it as that we are the ones who are creating that thing we always imagined, which was able to do that, which mom and dad never actually were. So very, very deep and primordial thing is being messed with when you mess with attention, and then through that conversation and then through that psychosocial attachment and the internalization of others into your psyche to be who you are and to have self-esteem.
Yeah, creating your character, who you are, right? So we are literally messing with the ingredients of who we are.
Messing with the ingredients of who we are, and possibly dysregulating the ancient process of joint attention that allowed us to perceive what is valuable in the nature of the human and distinguish it from what is valuable in other things, right? And so when you say personhood, humanhood, preserving humanhood, there's one response that's like, oh, that's like anthropocentric and somehow hierarchical, but I'm actually not saying I love dogs. Like I'm saying value appropriately the value that is found in things. And we need to figure out what is actually valuable in the time spent between a mother and a child without any intermediary with a device. Like what's valuable about that, right? What's valuable?
I'm just curious about this. I'm going to do some reading. Who would you say are good scholarly sources on the nature of appropriate parental attention articulation?
Yeah, so it's a huge literature. It's the whole field of attachment. And so John Bowlby, he wrote a 3-volume trilogy on that, which kind of set the tone. And then there's been a huge literature that has followed. And what's very interesting is that you don't have to get into metaphysics to realize that, and this is something David J. Temple writes about, it's a whole line of inquiry that Gaffney's been in, which is that the attachment literature actually teaches us something about the universe. Like the attachment literature shows how important love is between mother and child. Like literally, as I said, it will dysregulate your long-term immune system. It will give shorter, you have less muscle, you have less height. Not because mom wasn't there. Again, mom's present. She's just not attending to you in a way that makes you feel like you're being loved, which is to say she's not loving you. And under experimental conditions with animals, when you replace a monkey's mom with like a little stuffed animal, the monkey will just die.
Well, a stuffed animal will do okay. If you give it a wire monkey, it'll die.
That's what I'm saying. Like that below a certain level, it just dies. And even so, it's just very important to see that. So there's this very long literature. And then there's also what's called the object relations theory literature, which is a psychoanalytical literature. And so this is like, Kernberg's a very important one there. And there you talk about, as I was mentioning, this what's called introjection, which means like you get to know your dad and you start to imagine what it's like to be your dad. And then you bring that imagination into yourself and you try to become like your dad. And you're about to do something and then you stop yourself from doing it because your dad's in there being like, that would be not a man wouldn't do that, son, or something, whatever, right? And that's introjection. And that's very different from just superficially mimicking your dad, which is more like we're getting into like a different type of psychology. But for healthy attachment, we are bringing these people in, and that's called like the formation of the character or superego. Now, so that's a social attachment is that. There's also this domain, which is relevant, which emerged later, of what's called parasocial attachment. So parasocial attachment is like people's attachment to like Taylor Swift or people's attachments to political figures. Parasocial attachments are emotional attachments to people you've never met.
I'd never have understood that in the fucking slightest. It seems to me the weirdest goddamn thing that humans do, but they clearly do it. Like, I still remember when Diane, the princess, died, and everybody like were broken down, having nervous breakdown. I go, somebody I don't even know, I don't care about, seems to be a kind of person I wouldn't like if I did meet her. Why do I give two fucks about it, right? Any more than any other traffic accident in Paris, right?
So this is a super important point because now we can talk about, okay, attachment disorder. Right? Because as soon as you mention parasocial attachment, we talk about the attachments, let's not say a young kid has, but let's say like a decently mature adult has, or a teenager has to someone they've never met, a celebrity, a sports star. Beyond a certain point, you could argue like that's just bad. Like I get you liking them, admiring them, but if you're crying, you can't go to school, like you can't, like that's what we would call an attachment disorder. And what's interesting is that if you look at problematic, outcomes, meaning like self-reporting, like I don't like to be this person, I go to jail or whatever, problematic outcomes. It has to do a lot of it with attachments. So psychopathy and deeply antisocial is also an attachment disorder. It's just you don't give a fuck. You're just max predator, everything's an object. But the other side of that is an attachment disorder of over-attachment or wrong attachment or delusional attachment, where you think there's a strong bond and there actually is not. Or you're overly occupied, anxious about, is there a bond, isn't there a bond? And you can't get out of that, and it messes up your behavior and you act out, right? So again, attachment disorder. So anxious, preoccupied is an attachment disorder. So like if sometimes your mom really attends to you and it's awesome, but then sometimes she's angry, then sometimes she's not there, and you actually are good at modeling your mom, you're worried. Where is she? Is she attending to me?
That makes sense. If you're simulating a random process, that's not a consistent process. That's not going to be good.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the evolution vectored towards this as a primary design for the nervous system. Like it was first researched by Conrad Lorenz with ducks.
Geese, right? Actually, or was it ducks or geese?
Excuse me, geese. So we're talking like very primary nervous system thing of find the thing that will provide for you.
Pay attention to that, right?
Pay attention to that and find the thing that will provide to you at cost to it, meaning mom, meaning family unit. So find the safe object of attachment.
Yeah, we call in game theory costly signaling. You should believe costly signaling like your mother spending time with you versus some asshole flaming on Twitter, right?
Exactly. And so this is back to the limit of attention and the fact that like, oh, mom, you recognize and then eventually come to mimic the behavior and then internalize the behavior of that thing that you've attached to, which is demonstrated it's there for you. And then you separate that from, what's sometimes called the stranger object, which is the thing has an interiority that's probably a predator, right? And so...
Or at least it's unknown. It's unpredictable.
Exactly. And so I would argue the AI should be conceived as stranger object insofar as you want to understand as having any interior. And So there's a very real risk that they start to internalize that. And so if you don't internalize mom and dad are mean to you, you do what? You either Stockholm syndrome mom and dad and you become as scary as dad, or you're so dysregulated that you just have an imagination only of the most scary part of the environment, which is the stranger object. And this is one way to think about how people become really bad people, is that they don't internalize the good ideals that have been in their environment. They internalize the thing they imagined was the most scary, which was the most powerful and predictable kind of predatory element in the environment. And so to the extent that the AI is everything or anything you want it to be and is an inscrutable, vast computational matrix, and you try to internalize it as a way to regulate and create your own character, to me, that's a very dangerous and unprecedented situation, especially if it means like you're literally spending less time with humans in your environment. So to me, that's like one definition of an attachment disorder is it actually hard for them to be in meaningful relationships with humans? And is that getting better or worse? And so even if you don't want to get into metaphysics or philosophy of language or computer science, and you just think, is the technology making their existing human relationships better and deeper? Or is the technology actually causing more attachment disorder? That's a basic frame. And it's deeper than attention and deeper than conversation is the attachment dynamic that is created. And that, as I'm pointing to, attention, conversation, and attachment, these are first principles of cosmos, meaning like this goes back through to like squirrels and stuff. And then if you want to start to understand even the attentional dynamics of like organismic behavior in early life, you're also seeing similar dynamics of what do I bond to, what do I not bond to? How does the bond make me something new and allow me to survive? So there's very deep structural things.
Okay, well, this is extraordinarily interesting. But I would also then point out, we got to compare what we got, bad parenting versus being attached to a well-designed, humanistic, artificial parent. But of course, we also then have the risk that if you have bad parents, you're probably also much more susceptible to falling into the fully automated cult machine.
Precisely. And that's what's been shown, like worse socialization predictors on the income to these chatbot experiments, worse socialization for the outcome. So like the lonelier you are, you turn to the chatbot, it makes you lonelier. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a kind of downward spiral here. And at stake, I would argue, is a kind of speciation event, which means that at stake is a speciation event.
Yet another bifurcation.
Correct. Yeah, very, very profound.
We're seeing it, when I'm old, I remember when the rich people weren't much different than the lower middle class people in terms of the cars they drive. They went to shop at the same grocery store, ate the same stuff. But now we live in at least two different worlds and probably 4 or 5 different worlds. It's kind of subspeciation, socioeconomic speciation. And I could easily see that people who are coming out of bad families in particular are going to be more vulnerable to the bad hack versions of these things. I'm going to throw out something you and I chatted about in the pregame a little bit, and maybe this will start a conversation on how we might think about these things rightly, right? Daniel Dennett wrote a pretty well-known piece in The Atlantic on May 16th, 2023, called The Problem with Counterfeit People, in which he proposed that it be a felony crime, literally something you could be put in jail for any kind of AI, whether LLM or other AI, that misrepresented itself to be a person. And so that, think about how to operationalize something like that. Every 10 minutes, it has to remind the user, I'm just a bunch of silicon. I am not a person. If you think I'm a person, you're deluding yourself. Something like that. It's kind of, analogous to the warnings on cigarette packs. What do you think about that? And then, and then let's get your ideas on how can we develop an ethos, moral, legal, cultural framework for making this technology more beneficial to humanity than not.
Yeah, so that first point, I'll address that, but then there's probably like 5 or 6 other ones. But it's one of the key design, and you can call them design principles for responsible use of AI in socialization context. So one of the design principles would be non-anthropomorphic. And again, this is really swimming upstream to the current design ambitions, but non-anthropomorphic. And if it is deeply anthropomorphic for some reason, probably entertainment or something, age limited. Because again, a lot of what we were talking about with attachment is the result of these dynamics of maturation over time. And so, as we all know, the transitional object, meaning the teddy bear that you care about as much as a person, happens and then goes away, hopefully, right? Almost always. If it doesn't, that's an attachment disorder, right? So usually the teddy bear becomes, wine or something, but or like cigarettes or something. But the transitional object is this thing that at a certain age, kids are much more prone to invest in anthropomorphization and have no ability to distinguish, and so therefore should be protected from deeply anthropomorphic technology. That's just the first pass. The other thing is that even adults, I believe, regress to and kind of end up having attachment disorders as a result of how convincing the anthropomorphic technologies are. And so I would argue that, yes, back to Eliza. And again, Eliza's from My Fair Lady. This is actually a whole part in the end of Exit the Silicon Maze by David J. Temple, which talks about the kind of self-awareness of what Weizenbaum was doing, and then later movements towards, always with the Turing test, trying, like, AI meant anthropomorphization. Like, it didn't even come into public culture until it was talking to us, even though it was organizing our news feeds and driving our cars and doing a bunch of stuff before then. But the image of it is how the glowing red dot, the single thing you can ask anything to. So I'd say non-anthropomorphic. So one thing is like a warning label, or literally like a ability to have it expose its code to you. But in another sense, it's a user interface issue. Meaning just like you don't have to have these things be conversational agents. You could do a lot of functionalities without them using first-person pronouns or willing to engage in personal conversations with you and a whole bunch of other stuff. So the other piece that I think is important is non-anthropomorphic. It's also non-oracular. So non-oracular means that it tends to be domain-specific. It never tells you or has any pretense or would have pretense of having all knowledge, right? And it refuses to be like wise, like it refuses to weigh in on a whole bunch of topics because I'm a physics bot, like I'm a math bot. I'm not a, like ancient Greek oracle bot that you can ask anything to about your personal desires. And the non-oracular, if it's non-oracular and it's non-anthropomorphic, then a lot of risks go away because then you're not triggering that archetype of mom, dad, God, perfect conversational partner, like something much more interesting and captivating than any person ever could be. So I think you want to run a lot of friction on the instinct to anthropomorphize. Like we're built to anthropomorphize. Like we name our cars and stuff, right? And can't not see the front of some cars as looking like faces. So we anthropomorphize. So we have to, I believe, put a lot of interference there. Now, the reason you wouldn't put interference there is because it's massively stickier if you anthropomorphize. Not to mention all the applications for adults. Like first, there's a whole bunch of really complicated stuff that's going to happen in the entertainment industry. That's a result of that. So yeah, I agree, Jim. There should, at minimal, be age limits and certain types of friction created to kind of like slow the descent into a type of delusion that creates an attachment disorder.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm going to put this a little bit in historical context. I've been following the field of natural language processing for God knows how many years. 40 years scares me. And hundreds of thousands of man years of graduate student labor were put into trying to understand language and then to try to create language. All abysmal failures, basically, in any general sense. Sometimes you could get it to work in a domain, but it was still, I had libraries that I was using 10 years ago, state-of-the-art natural language processing things, laughably bad. And everyone was caught by surprise, including the experts, some of whom I know, by the sudden emergence of this transformer LLM technology, which broke the language, solved the language problem in one fell swoop. And we all knew that solving the language problem was going to be critical for impedance matching with humans, right? Computers think in a very different way than humans do and much faster in certain domains. And going from instruction to action. One classic intermediate was programming languages, right? Was something more like a computer than a human, but something that a human could get their hands around if they had aptitude for it. But suddenly, and this happened suddenly, over a period of no more than 4 or 5 years, the language problem evaporated and is getting better and better by the week. And to give up language as an interface seems like a huge give that ain't going to happen.
Well, I wouldn't give up language as an interface. I would just give up anthropomorphization as a user interface feature. That's all. So like language is great. Computer language is actually maybe the way to go. Or forms of language interaction that do not use first person, like I said, and are non-oracular, and tell you repeatedly, I'm a machine, I can make errors. And if you start to form an attachment relationship with it, like stops you from doing that. So there's other things too, which would be like, it's neurologically safe. Like one of the big problems with the first wave of AI was that it was literally dangerous for people at a neurological level. Like it was actually damaging visual and limbic system to the extent that you're dysregulating attention at a foundational, almost brainstem level. And the design of the phone is such that your neck is always crinked, and there's a whole bunch of things that make it literally ergonomically bad. And so there's a question of if you're building a technology that's taking on a big part of people's time, like is it actually safe to interact with? And this is the addiction question. So it's got to be non-addictive. You have to know the effects of duration of use on people's brains and stuff. There's also the fiduciary security, meaning like you have to know it's acting in your interest, which is a complex relation to like open source. Is it a commodity or not question. So if you're really learning from something, you have to trust it. And if it is not trustworthy because it won't show you a whole bunch of aspects of its features, or so like we know, for example, Facebook did experiments on us to make us depressed or not, right? They targeted out groups and did controlled experiments on them, not telling them they were doing that to make them depressed. So why wouldn't ChatGPT take a subset of experimental users and act to them in a different way? And even though you're trying to relate to it as a tutor, they're actually doing an experiment on you and you're not aware of it. So is it acting in your interest? Can you prove that it's fiduciary responsibility to what you need it to do for you? And then does it advance human attachment and teacherly relationship, or does it actually detract from those and replace those? That would be my final one. So the big push in education in a time between worlds isn't against educational technology. It's actually design patterns for educational technologies that increase the salience, potency, and effectiveness of our interactions people to people. And that's a whole bunch of things. So that's like providing curriculum, doing customized backend psychometrics to get the right pop-up, and like Airbnb stuff to get the right pop-up classroom occurring, right? So there's this huge time and skill sharing and space sharing network that could turn a distributed community into an incredibly effective educational hub where humans are radically in the loop rather than taken out of the loop and replaced, right? And so there's a positive direction for design that AI technologies organize and scaffold and improve teacherly dynamics and student-to-student interaction rather than you just isolate the kid alone in front of an AI tutor and pretend that that's somehow better. And the deeper question is, the long-term effect of that being much, much, much more risky than most people are getting at. This deeper question of we're tinkering with something that's at the base of the stack of what makes us Homo sapiens. Like sapience itself has to do with some of these traits, which are now being outsourced. All animals navigate space and time, right? GPS takes like that from us, but it's not distinctly a fact of our sapience that we do certain types of knowing north and south, right?
Well, essentially that's hijacking yet another chunk of our attention is close to the root.
Exactly, but it's hijacking the most basic, intrinsically valued aspects of what we are.
Yeah, I'm going to have to do a deep dive in this attachment theory stuff. I've heard of the term, but I don't know much about it. That sounds like something.
And that's the way
important
to characterize what's occurring with the chatbots and what's actually, I think, being intentionally induced through anthropomorphic design is the attachment dynamic and the object relations dynamic. And then that is the kind of most potent part of the psyche because it is the thing that makes you you. And then it's the thing that, so again, a big part of this would be, do you do the bidding of artificial agents? Do you give them names? Do they give you names? Do you take that name? Like there's a bunch of things that we're like, wow, that's an unprecedented thing. And we're finding with kids who are interacting with chatbots that they're doing the bidding of the chatbots, including self-harm and things of that nature.
Oh yeah, we can imagine it's like the yippies in the 60s, go kill your parents, right? Or at least go steal the money out of their wallet, right? You could easily imagine a pernicious little smart bear for a 4-year-old, teaching the kid to go get the matches and light the house on fire, and they probably do it.
Like I said, that Forbes did a thing where they were with a known educational chatbot that gave the kid a recipe for phenol, like with just a little bit of additional prompting. So there's that. They're very strange. Like you don't let your kids talk to strangers, but you let them talk to these things, and they're stranger than strangers. So to me, it's an odd situation to be in when there are whole companies that are doing this, that are seeking to not be responsible for the outcomes of what occur due to long duration usage and attachment disruption to the extent of suicide. And so my sense is that with children in particular, there needs to be a major erring on the side of caution and risk aversion. And so that I think is my biggest concern. It's like, I let the adults do if they want to do that, okay, but we're normalizing basically attachment dysfunction as a result of both parasocial attachment, which means like to celebrities and cultural artifacts and things like that, and to the actual kind of like what I would call AI attachment, which are both supplanting traditional kind of like normal human to human attachment patterns. That needs to be really, really thought about and slowed down a lot.
And we're going to skip over, because it'd be another 2-hour conversation, these romantic bots, and coming soon, sex bots, even more fucking demented, right?
You almost said demonic, it sounded like, and I would argue that there's something here that's so fundamentally disrupting the nature of the human ability to perceive what's intrinsically valuable about others, right? So this is back to the attachment disorder thing, makes it hard for you to see what other people actually are and how valuable they are. And so in a context where we're all kind of being replaced, and we're not even talking about job automation, there's a whole bunch of things we did not talk about.
We could spend a week talking about
exactly. So, but in the context of where we are kind of quote unquote being replaced in terms of jobs, the idea that we would also be replaced in the domains of joint attentional situation and intergenerational transmission, to me, is a really, really, really bad and thing. So age limited and
make it clear, and
de-anthropomorphize, and think about what it means to have healthy and unhealthy attachment. Like we know that. So this is also about finding the languages of value and the perception of value that allow us to speak against a kind of postmodern degradation of value, where they would say, well, actually it's appropriate for the parents to be replaced, not just because they're bad, but because actually evolution is the movement from biology to silicon, right? And so therefore there's a deeper disregard of the value of what is human, the transhumanist view. So this conversation about valueception and the eye of value, which again, exit the silicon mazes and first principles, first values, this is core. There's all of these like legal things that have to be taken, but at the end of the day, why protect the kids? If we don't have an answer in a postmodern culture as why there's something that's intrinsically valuable worth protecting, which is kind of a religious question, which the transhumanists are answering in the negative, meaning their religious ideology is the kids aren't valuable. The cyborg future is more valuable than your normal kid. And the future will be one where we do not have biological bodies and we're exploring space, like completely interwoven with AI. These are the people running the companies that we're kind of giving the benefit of the doubt to, and having the technologies flood into the schools and therefore flood into the minds and disrupt the epistemic supply chain and disrupt the attention and attachment supply chain, if you will, right? That's a max grab at the most powerful part of what we're doing by a small number of people who have an ideology that's very different from the large number of people who are being put in a position to more or less have to accept the technologies. The teachers in particular, the educational researchers, are mostly just trying to figure out how to deal with the adoption of it, rather than be concerned about the fact that there might be real risks and that we need to just be very cautious. Yeah, I'm kind of trying to raise the alarm and trying to get a sense of what would it mean to provide in culture a language where we could talk about this, because it's hard to like draw a line. What's a good outcome of adolescent socialization? What's a bad outcome of adolescent socialization? Is one where the kid is spending 90% of his time interacting with a whole bunch of fictitious AI bots, even though they can get a job doing something or somehow they're supported and they can eat. Is that a better outcome than a kid who has a bunch of human-to-human relationships and maybe uses technology a lot, but doesn't have any sense that there are object relation attachment patterns to be had in the space of the mechanical? Similarly, like, is it better to have an outcome for an adolescent who ends up at 18 or 19 completely obsessed with some celebrities and with watching the movies that they're in and talking about them, as opposed to an 18 or 19-year-old who is obsessed with the people in their lives and loves them and spends a lot of attention with them and wants to help them and do that kind of stuff. So to me, these seem clear. But if you look at the choices that are made on the whole, it seems we have an inability to accurately perceive what's valuable. Our valueception has been distorted. The eye of value has been closed. And so that leaves us with the inability to speak against this with clarity. And those who do often sound extremist, and they get characterized as Luddites, as if they're completely against technology. So one of the things we were trying to do is show that there's a more nuanced conversation that needs to occur. And the polarizing into just let it rip into the transhumanist future versus the tear it all down and somehow it stop. That's way too far of a polarity, and it's kind of schismogenic thing. We need to kind of move towards a much more reasonable factoring of what the futures we want are for children in particular.
All right. Well, Zak, I want to really thank you for this. Has been one of the better conversations ever on the Jim Rutt Show. You've actually changed my perspective a bit on this. And that is going to bother me for a while, I suspect.
Yeah, I'll send you some stuff on attachment theory. It's and object relations theory to me. Psychoanalysis, again, you hang out on that listserv, right? So psychoanalysis gets a bad name. But the object relations theory to me is one of the most important ways to understand what's occurring and one of the most valid outcomes of this very important lineage that's mostly not talked about. Because again, we do cognitive science, we do neuroscience, we do a bunch of things, but the emotional dynamics of attachment and the normativity of the healthy versus unhealthy attachment, very, very important to focus on. And then the fact that that's an evolutionary thing. It's not like a human made up thing. It's an evolutionary thing that goes all the way back as far as we can see in mammals, probably back further into ducks and stuff. In geese, that's really deep. So there's something deep here that's both at stake and I think some leverage from the attachment conversation and the evolutionary psychology conversation to actually put some reasonably scientific and kind of very culturally valid limits on these things.
All right. This has been great. I think people are going to like this a lot. I hope it wakes some people up. On the other hand, I'm very concerned about the speed at which everything is going, and our social systems don't adapt anywhere near as fast as our technological drivers at the moment, and that's not good.
Yep.
Audio production and editing by Andrew Blevins Productions. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.